Thank you for your interest in the Peaks to People Water Fund. Our presenters today are Heather Schinkel and Ben Gannon. The webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour with ample time reserved for questions at the end. All attendees are in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. To submit your question at any time, please use the chat feature in the bottom left of your screen. Questions will be collected and asked to the presenters during a Q&A session at the end. I will now pass it over to Peter Stengel with the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities to introduce our speakers. Peter?
Hey, Cameron, thank you. Well, good day, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you on. This is an exciting day for us because this is the first webinar for the Healthy Watersheds Consortium grant program, and we're thrilled to have Heather and Ben presenting today. I have the pleasure at the endowment of administering this grant program and want to thank Cameron Tommy, who just welcomed you all, and Ellie Gay, our intern, for all their administrative support. And also want to give a big thanks to Jeff Lerner and Kitty Weissman, who are consultants to the endowment and who provide invaluable assistance in helping me administer the program and leading the way forward for us. Also want to take a second to acknowledge our colleagues and friends at the Environmental Protection Agency for their vision in conceiving of the Healthy Watersheds Consortium grant program and for funding it. Without their leadership, the endowment wouldn't be here funding the program. And also want to thank our friends and colleagues at the Natural Resources Conservation Service for becoming part of this effort as well. So the endowment, EPA, and NRCS are co-funders, and look forward to a couple more years of great grant programs. If you haven't already seen it, the new request for proposals is out on the endowment's website, www.usendowment.org. You can find all the information you need there about the upcoming grant cycle. We look forward to talking with you about project ideas. So thrilled to have Heather and Ben with us today. We've urged them to not only give us an overview of their program, but also to be forthright about their successes as well as their challenges. The purpose for these webinars is to not only share our victories, but also talk about the challenges that we've encountered. And I have no doubt that some of you listening in today may be able to help Heather and Ben with some of the challenges they've encountered, and that they may be able to help you with some of the things you're encountering in your watershed as well. So we view this as an important learning opportunity and look forward to lots of good dialogue. They're going to give a relatively brief presentation, then we'll have lots of time for questions. Let me tell you a little bit about Heather and Ben. Before joining Peaks to People, Heather has held a variety of natural resource leadership and policy management roles, including some with the Fairfax County, Virginia Park Authority, the Forest Stewardship Council, and the U.S. Army. She has a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, and a Master's in Forestry from the Duke University Nicholas School of the Environment in Durham, North Carolina. Her co-presenter, Ben Gannon, is a research associate with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, which is located at Colorado State University. There he works on a variety of management-driven questions in fire ecology, forest restoration, and watershed science. And as you'll learn today, he's most recently worked with the team at Colorado State to develop a decision support system to help the Peaks to People Water Fund spatially prioritize forest management investments at large landscape scales to reduce wildfire risk to water resources. So with that introduction, Cameron, if you'll shift it back to Heather, we'll get started. And thank you, Heather and Ben.
Go ahead, Heather.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction, and we're so happy to be here. You can go to the next slide. Before we begin, I wanted to explain kind of how the presentation is going to run today. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about Peaks to People in general and our proof of concept phase, and talk about kind of where we are now and what the grant has helped do for us. And then Ben is going to spend about 10 minutes on our watershed investment tool and talk about how that tool is built and what that does for us as well. And then I'll wrap up with a couple minutes of kind of talking about, as Peter alluded to, some frank discussion points on some of the challenges we've run into and are currently facing and kind of what we see as our future. So first, to set the stage in terms of where we are, we're in northern Colorado, in the Northern Front Range. Our focus is on the Cache La Poudre and the Big Thompson watersheds. They're two pretty significantly sized watersheds in the northern Front Range of Colorado. And what we're really focused on is developing a water fund, basically where downstream water beneficiaries fund water fire mitigation work in the upper watershed. So really trying to address the issue of severe wildfire in our region. We did have a study done several years ago that I wanted to just touch on briefly that was more of a desktop analysis that looked at sort of the green versus gray solutions in these two watersheds. They studied both the downstream watersheds as well as the upper watersheds, looking at fire mitigation projects, so essentially forest management and forest thinnings versus business as usual and letting fires occur as we predict. And they found a pretty significant cost savings in terms of reducing the cost of wildfire with a mitigation program by in the order of a few $100 million. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're in what we're calling our proof of concept phase. During that phase, we are hosted by the Center for Collaborative Conservation here at Colorado State University, as well as the Nature Conservancy. They are also both funders. This phase began a couple years ago and runs through December 2018. Funders for this phase, the funding totals just over $1 million in donations and grants. We have a large grant from an anonymous foundation, an individual donor, funding from a couple of the local breweries, as well as the Center for Collaborative Conservation and the Nature Conservancy. And then, of course, we were the proud recipients of the Healthy Watershed Consortium grant. That grant was in total $150,000 plus our matching funds, and really propelled us forward in three areas: the watershed investment tool that Ben's going to talk about, our market research and business plan, and then our marketing and communications. And it really has made a huge difference and really filled a big gap that we saw as we were piecing together the funding for this phase. We also have a strong working group that consists of our local water providers, conservation practitioners, landowners, and breweries. And then I wanted to point out to you, I meant to go over this in the background slide. The two watersheds, as I mentioned, are quite large. They serve about 300,000 water users in terms of drinking water. So let's see, next slide, please. So just to kind of, for those that don't deal with the same issues that we do in our watersheds, the threat really is severe wildfire. Basically related to the idea that we've suppressed fire for so many years, our forests are not really in a natural state. They're overstocked. And while wildfire may be normal in these ecosystems, when there's too much fuel and the forests are overstocked, the wildfire is much more severe. We're very much focused on the impacts to water, so mainly sedimentation. Next slide, please. We did have a recent example in 2012. The High Park fire came through, burned over 90,000 acres. Water sources were impacted, as well as quality of life and tourism. There were over $100 million in insured home losses, millions of dollars in fire suppression costs, among other things. Next slide. So our solution is premised on the idea of payment for ecosystem services. So what we hope to do is set up a model where the landowners in the upper watersheds that are providing benefits in terms of managing the forests appropriately and reducing wildfire risk are rewarded by these downstream water users. What's a little bit unique about us versus some of the other programs you might know about like this is we're not just focused on the water utilities as funders, but also other water-dependent businesses. This could be breweries or manufacturers, health systems, anybody that is dependent on water for their business. Next slide. I wanted to point out that while we are focused on water, there are many other benefits to these projects. There's improved wildlife habitat, there's avoided costs in terms of impacts to recreation and tourism, as well as reduction in property losses, potential avoided emissions of carbon, as well as reduced costs in fire suppression. Next slide. So I wanted to touch on four of the main phases of this proof of concept phase. The first is our demonstration sites. We do have one demonstration site in each watershed. But the purpose of these sites are a couple of reasons. One is for us to kind of learn about the logistics of carrying out these forest thinning projects. And then also to show the public and other partners and potential funders what these projects look like, what the forests look like before and after treatment, as well as to do some pre and post monitoring and use that to kind of validate our treatment specifications and what our standards will be as we move forward and do these projects that are funded by these water beneficiaries. You can see on the lower right picture that's a pile burning that was done last winter in our Ramsey Shockey site, which is in the Big Thompson watershed. So we did a thinning and then in the winter burned the piles to remove the residual fuel. And then the other picture is actually just from last Friday on our other site in the Castle Pooter on a private property in partnership with a number of other funders, did a prescribed burnout there. So we were happy to have that pulled off last week as planned. Next slide. The next key component of the proof of concept phase is the program design. So we're working with Environmental Incentives, which is a consulting firm that helps organizations develop payment for ecosystem services programs. And so we are working on currently leaning towards a sort of pay for success model where we have beneficiaries come to us and we enter into a performance contract agreement with them. We supply the funds to the land steward, which could be an existing implementer or a landowner directly or other agency. It could be Forest Service, et cetera. We would have some sort of verification piece, which potentially could be a third party that verifies that the benefits that we anticipated to occur actually did occur. And then payment potentially at the end, the final payment may be contingent upon that performance piece. This program design is still very much up in the air. We're going to listen really hard to the implementers and landowners as well as potential funders about how complicated or not complicated hopefully they need this to be and adjust it accordingly as we move forward out of our proof of concept phase. Next slide, please. And then the final thing I want to touch on before I turn this over to Ben to spend some time on the Watershed investment tool is the market research and business plan as well as marketing and communications. You can see there's a screenshot of our new website. We rebranded, renamed. We used to be called the Colorado Conservation Exchange. I think the Peaks People Water Fund is much more clear and direct about what we're trying to accomplish. We have great, really well done marketing materials and a great website as well as a video, which is on our website if you want to check it out. I think that's going to go a long way to helping us be really clear about what our message is, what we're trying to accomplish, and hopefully be successful in securing long-term funding for these two watersheds. And I should say that's really what our goal is. So Peaks to People is hoping to be the mechanism to set large long-term goals for forest restoration, fire mitigation in these two watersheds, and hoping to be the impetus to get that funding, to get large-scale and recurring funding, not only from water-dependent businesses, but from our water providers to fund this work. So our business plan helps try to work that out in terms of laying out a strategy for which businesses we should talk to. They identified 18 companies through just desktop research in terms of looking at their history of philanthropy, their water usage, other sustainability efforts. I've got 18 companies that we're targeting as potential funders of us, as well as they looked at kind of what are the gaps in terms of what's needed in these two watersheds and how can people fill that role. They also did a short report on other ecosystem services. As I mentioned, there's these co-benefits to this work, and I really wanted to have a roadmap to if, when, and how should we bring on other co-benefits, whether that's just talking about them or actually spending money and developing another program where we're marketing the other benefits to other beneficiaries besides just water beneficiaries. Next slide, please. So before I turn this over to Ben, just want to tell you briefly on a high level kind of what the Watershed Investment Tool does for us. Essentially what it does is it optimizes these forest treatment plans for the biggest return on investment, and that return on investment is avoided sediment. That's further optimized on the features of concern that our water providers identified as most important to them. And so we are able to take kind of this large problem and really focus it in on where can we have the greatest impact for our restoration dollar in the context of the greatest influence to the water features that are most important to our potential funders. And then on top of that, we can customize these treatment plans based on different budgets and also on different priorities. So there might be a different treatment plan for the city of Fort Collins versus the city of Greeley, or even one of the businesses might say, here's where I get my water. I only want to work in, these areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben. He's going to spend about the last 10 minutes talking about the tool, and then I'll wrap up and talk a little bit about our lessons learned as well as next steps. Ed.
Thanks, Heather. Can we advance to the next slide, please? Thanks. I'll start off by providing some geographic context for the pilot project area, which is the upper portions of Cache la Poudre and Big Thompson watersheds in northern Colorado and southeast Wyoming. This is a large planting area with diverse vegetation, climate that varies widely with elevation, and mixed land ownership. The main water stakeholders are three municipalities, the city of Fort Collins, Greeley and Loveland, and the Northern Water Conservancy District. Northern Water distributes supplemental water to these same communities from a large trans-basin diversion, the Colorado Big Thompson Project, which also provides water to other municipal, agricultural, and industrial uses. But we've got these three municipal water providers as well as the Northern Water Conservancy District. And really the exciting part about this project is they've got a portfolio of different water resources that are impacted and exposed to post-fire sediment in different ways. Next slide. So we developed what we're calling the Watershed Investment Tool to help the Peaks People Water Fund both measure the risk of wildfire-related increases in sediment delivery to water infrastructure and use those measures of risk with and without fuel treatment, as well as additional information on treatment feasibilities and costs to help plan optimal fuel treatment investments. So the design of this tool was highly influenced by the wildfire risk assessment framework being used by the U.S. Forest Service, which includes three components. The first is wildfire likelihood, which we bring in from a burn probability modeling project done by Karen Short with the U.S. Forest Service. And then the other component is we need to know what kind of fire behavior we expect in different parts of the landscape. So we bring this in with some wildfire modeling that we do in FlamMap. And we do this for both untreated, so baseline conditions, as well as treated scenarios. And this gets at how fuel treatment is going to change fire behavior. The third part of this wildfire risk triangle is we need to know how susceptible our resources are, which we model using the revised universal soil loss equation, which is an erosion model, for treated and untreated scenarios by connecting the effects of fire behavior to changes in cover and soil erodibility. So the rest of this model addresses the exposure of water infrastructure by routing sediment down the network and bringing in the fuel treatment constraints. The GIS, fire, and erosion modeling is all pre-processed and then fed into the Watershed Investment Tool, where the Peaks to People Water Fund can then control budget and implementation constraints. Next slide. Thank you. So fuel treatment effects and erosion are being measured in this portion of the model where we connect fire behavior outputs to the revised universal soil loss equation to represent changes in cover and soil erodibility as a function of low, moderate, and high severity fire. Here we're showing erosion estimates for the unburned baseline condition and the burned untreated scenario. We can rerun this loop with different fuel treatment simulated in the input data to the fire model, and then difference the erosion estimates for treated and untreated scenarios to get at treatment effects. You can see in the map on the left that we still have some residual effects of the 2012 High Park fire, which is that red outline you see. But elsewhere, we expect fire will increase erosion 1 to 2 orders of magnitude over baseline conditions, which is consistent with local studies of post-fire erosion. Next slide, please. So pre-processed fire and erosion modeling results are fed into a decision support system that then allows the Peaks to People Water Fund to analyze fuel treatment benefits and plan optimal fuel treatment programs with controls for budget and implementation constraints. Analysis and graphics I will present in the following slides are then all automated outputs produced by the Watershed Investment Tool. So this is what the Peaks to People Water Fund sees when they use this Watershed Investment Tool. Next slide, please. One of the exciting aspects about this project is the challenge of dealing with dispersed and diverse infrastructure. We embrace this aspect of planning by making the cost of sediment delivery to infrastructure an input that can easily be modified by the end user. The tool translates the cost assigned to infrastructure, which are the rows in this table and the black dots on the map, into the value of retaining that sediment in the watershed measured here on this map in dollars per metric ton of sediment. Assigning a monetary value to sediment impact is what allows us to directly compare fuel treatment costs and benefits. The model uses this information to translate sediment reduction in any given catchment, so these small sub-watershed units, into the downstream cost at infrastructure. Changing the value assigned to infrastructure modifies the priorities of where to invest across the watersheds. Giving this control to the end user facilitates experimentation when there's uncertainty in sediment costs. This intermediate sediment retention value map has also proved effective at communicating how the tool uses the economic data and the physical process models to make these connections between the values and the land you can manage. Next slide, please. So the math behind the model is simple, which allows for fast analysis in open source software and produces intermediate products which are easy to understand. We calculate the expected benefit of treatment in terms of avoided sediment cost, which is the product of burn probability, sediment avoided from treatment, and sediment costs to infrastructure. And so this probability component of experiencing fire is really important for us to consider, since we've conceived of the benefit as being avoided some kind of post-fire impact. We can then put the benefit of fuel treatments into a benefit cost ratio so they can be compared against the cost of treatment. Next slide, please. So these maps show the benefit cost ratios for each treatment type that we're considering, which is, you can see there's 3 different treatment types: a mechanical only treatment, mechanical followed by prescribed fire, and prescribed fire only. And we're showing this for each treatment type across catchments with feasible acres for that treatment type. So some of the places on the maps are blanked out where there's no feasible acres, for example, to apply mechanical only treatment in some of the higher elevation wilderness areas that we have. The absolute numbers aren't very important, but what I want you to see is that there's higher benefit to cost areas are highlighted in red, and those that are lower are in green. And the values are binned on a log scale, so the benefit cost ratio of treatment is highly variable across the landscape, which confirms the importance of strategic investment. We can then use a model to sort the catchment treatment type combinations and assemble an optimal treatment plan using an algorithm that respects total budget and feasibility constraints. Next slide. So here's just an example of an optimal treatment plan for a $100 million budget to protect all the resources that we had in that table a few slides ago. The treatment plan specifies the number of acres of fuel treatment at the catchment level, shown in the map on the left, and the bar plot on the right accounts for the baseline risk and what risk reduction, so that green portion of the bar, can be achieved by implementing that mapped treatment plan. In this scenario, we get a little bit more than a 25% risk reduction, and that's measured in terms of wildfire-related sediment costs over a 25-year planning period. The baseline risk is highly variable across infrastructure, and the risk reduction is dispersed across multiple features, being driven by a combination of fuel treatment effects across the landscape, opportunities, and costs. This was produced from what we're calling our optimization module, which requires a budget or budget levels that the user wants to explore. We also have a program objectives module, which takes a % risk reduction goal and reports back on the investment needed to achieve that goal. So it can be used in both contexts. So behind these graphics are tabular data, which provide an ordered list of fuel treatment priorities that the Peaks to People Water Fund can use to target investments. And now I'm going to hand it back to Heather to conclude with some final remarks.
Thanks, Ben. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'll try to briefly touch on some successes and challenges that we've seen and what we're hoping to accomplish next, and then leave plenty of time for questions. I think our biggest challenge, first and foremost, is what I touched on in the beginning, is truly the scope of the problem. These watersheds are enormous, and if you look at some of the existing studies out there, treating those priority areas or even treating 20% of these watersheds is talking potentially on the order of $1 billion or so in restoration, which is just not realistic. I think what we have going for us is the tool that Ben just talked about. Is it really, this watershed investment tool will help us set more realistic goals and really demonstrate where we can have influence in terms of the benefits to water. The other complication we have versus some other similar programs across the West is our water providers really have redundancy and complexity in their water systems that make it hard to make a really solid business case that to fund this work. So they have options. And so, for instance, the city of Fort Collins was able to pull from the Horseshoe Reservoir and the Big Thompson when we had the High Park fire come through. So to try to make the case for large-scale investment is complicated by that sort of water security. So we've talked about potentially, do we talk about modeling 2 events, 1 in each watershed? How do we kind of get at understanding truly what the risk is in terms of to our water supplies? We also have some concerns with perceptions of competition. There are existing organizations out there that are doing some of this fire mitigation work already, and there's concern that we're going to be competing for the same sources of funding. And my hope is that in that area, that if we're successful in kind of being the ones that are the impetus for setting big, large-scale goals for these 2 watersheds, and we bring in alternative resources in terms of the water-dependent businesses, and then bring in funding from the water providers at a scale that's not seen before, that this issue of competition will go away, is my hope. We also run into a lot of challenges with terminology. When we talk about investment fund, when we talk about water beneficiary, that means different things to different people, and it gets really confusing when people start to think that we're talking about a financial return, when in fact we're not. Another example is we talk about return on investment, and what we're talking about is the biggest impact for your restoration dollar, not an actual financial return. So when we look at the numbers related to avoided costs in terms of sediment, there's not a financial return. What is important when we talk about that is that we're having the greatest impact possible per restoration dollar in terms of avoided impacts to water resources. And then one of the things that we're working on is how we articulate all the other co-benefits that go along with it that make these investments worth it. In terms of next steps, we are going to work with existing funders to identify potential sources of funding. Essentially, our sort of startup proof of concept funding runs out December 2018, so we have a little over a year to kind of figure out what this next step is. So we'll also be working with the water-dependent businesses, identified in the business plan. I'm leaning towards sort of a second proof of concept phase. So the idea would be to try to raise some seed funding to work at a larger scale, so probably in the order of $2 to $3 million. Hopefully much of that comes from alternative sources and not from the water providers, and really show that we can bring resources in at scale, and then we can execute at scale. So right now, Peaks to People is working on 2 small implementation projects, 1 in each watershed, so to really show that we can execute, work effectively with partners, and that there's capacity on the ground to do this work at a different scale. And then we are, in terms of the watershed investment tool, it was, I meant to mention after Ben was done, to point out that this tool was built with the idea that it should be easily expanded and used by others. So most of the data that is used in it is readily available, and we've already, or Ben has already been working on looking at how it may be explored in terms of geographic extent. So we'll be continuing to improve the tool, including looking at the expansion potential, as well as exploring the different co-benefits and whether we can use the tool to actually articulate in some way what the value is of all these other benefits to these projects. So that is all we have. I think we have plenty of time for questions. I so appreciate everybody's time today in listening to us and interest. I look forward to your questions, and of course I'm so thankful for the support of the Healthy Watershed Consortium grant. It really has propelled us forward and filled in some major gaps, and I think it's gone a long way to hopefully move us in the right trajectory. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Heather and Ben, for that interesting overview of the Water Fund. We've had a few questions come in, but I'll remind everybody to use the chat feature in the bottom left of your screen to submit a question for Heather or Ben. I'll also add here that we have recorded this session, and we'll be posting it on our website within a day or two with a shareable link if anyone would like to share this with their colleagues or organization. So with that, I'll move over to the Q&A session. We'll start with a question for Heather. Heather, you noted in one of your earlier slides that a recent fire caused more than $100 million in damage and insurance claims. Have you considered engaging the insurance industry to have them help support the water fund?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first I'll say that that's one of the modules that Ben is already working on in terms of modeling potential avoided home loss or structure loss. We have not yet formally tried to engage with the industry. What I've heard anecdotally from other similar programs is they've not been successful, but it's certainly on our radar to keep thinking about.
Great, thank you. This looks like a question for Ben. Will the Watershed investment tool be available for others to use?
That's a good question too. I think where we're at right now with it is testing it in these watersheds, and I think just to make sure that it's both useful in terms of capturing what people think erosion, post-fire erosion risk is, and then also, one of the challenges that Heather didn't really get to touch on a lot was just making sure that it's speaking to the values that people have in terms of planning. So are the types of results that we're communicating out of the tool actually speaking to the stakeholders, the water utility providers? So does that fit into their management framework in the best way possible? So we're working on those things.
Yeah, and I'll add,
Great.
One of the things I haven't decided, originally I envisioned this really cool user interface, at least for the context of our two watersheds. And so landowners could go look up their property, or an investor could, push some buttons to determine, I have $1 million and here are the things I want to invest in. We haven't decided if it's best for us to handle that one-on-one, or if that should be online, or if there's some other version that should be online. So you may see something eventually on our website in terms of being able to at least play around with the data in the context of our two watersheds.
Great, thank you both. Here's a general question for one or both of you. You now have a couple years under your belt working on this specific project. If you had known then what you know now, what one or two things would you have done differently?
Yeah, there's a few things, I guess. I think we did a couple. Let me start with an easy one, which Ben might want to chime in too, but I know that Ben for sure has shared, man, we wish we had reached out to water providers about their infrastructure and the costs and priorities related to their infrastructure and understood their water infrastructure sooner. Would have been better and a lot more efficient in terms of how we built the tool and how we're refining it now. I think the other thing we did, and I do think we oversold the idea that this could be a payment for ecosystem services program in a traditional sense. There's no regulatory driver. There's no real return on investment in terms of a water-dependent business investing in this work. They're going to do it because they see it a little bit from a risk management perspective, but also from a community benefit perspective. And I don't think they're going to do it on a recurring basis. I do think we have great potential to be successful in getting water-dependent businesses, non-traditional sources, to fund us, but I don't think it's the ultimate answer. And if we had been more clear about that from the beginning, I think we might be in a better place right now.
And this is Ben. I'll just kind of echo what Heather mentioned, is that I think a really critical thing here is don't just pick up some kind of model of how you've seen other people do this sort of avoided cost analysis. Make sure that you really engage early on with your potential stakeholders, whether they're water utilities or water-dependent businesses, and really understand how they perceive risk. I think a lot of people have seen things like the Mokelumne avoided cost analysis or some of the other avoided cost analysis work done in the South Platte Basin here in Colorado related to Denver water's resources. And so it's just really important to recognize that not everyone's utility has the same type of infrastructure that's going to be impacted in the same way. And so they might come up with very different values than what have been published in some of these other studies. So make sure to connect with them and really understand their needs early.
Thank you both. Another question. We have a participant who's interested in starting a water fund for their area, and they're recognizing there's a lot of factors that go into that. how would you recommend that they get started? Should they talk with a water utility or local industries first, build a coalition? What's your advice?
All the above, I guess. And I would, you know what, with anything like this too, I would just reach out to other organizations. There's so many programs out there, and they all evolved in different ways. So I don't think there's no one right answer in terms of what's first. I do think, what I was going to say, that there's lots of resources out there. There's Carpedium West would be a good website to check out in terms of what's going on in the West in terms of these kinds of programs. And also the Nature Conservancy. They have water funds throughout the world and have been doing this for many, many years. They have a water fund toolbox on their website that gives you all kinds of great information and step-by-step guides on how to build a water fund. So I would start there.
Great, thank you. This one goes to both of you. Is there any one specific thing that the folks listening in today or in the broader watershed protection community could do to help you in this project? Recognizing that we've got a diverse group here, we have some of our other Healthy Watershed Consortium members listening in, other watershed protection groups participating. Any message you'd like to send?
Yeah, other than giving us some magical money, which would be nice. No, you know what we're really struggling with is this next phase. You know, for me, we haven't yet made the case with the utilities. They're not ready to fund us, and they ultimately are the long-term solution, I think. And so trying to figure out, you know, will we ever get there, and what does Peaks to People need to provide to make that case? And what's that going to take? Because that's going to take years. It's not the utility staff that are engaged with us right now, they don't have control over the budgets. So it's not as simple as getting buy-in at the staff level and at the leadership level, but figuring out then how do you fund it? What are all the different mechanisms? And so it's a long-term solution. So I guess what I'm, you know, just really struggling with is kind of, you know, can I be successful in raising some significant alternative funding in the short term to kind of give us some time to build that case and build that strategy in the long term? I'm not looking for an answer right now, but that's like my biggest struggle, I guess, right now.
And this is Ben. You know, one thing that I think we've kind of faced as a challenge in this project is finding effective ways to communicate risk to our potential stakeholders. And so, and you saw we came up with a tool that I think communicates some outputs that get at risk and risk reduction. But what we found really was that none of the utilities that we engaged with or Northern Water had a framework that was explicitly laid out necessarily to accept a particular output from a tool like this. And so I think one of the challenging things that really this community could benefit from would be having some guides on how to communicate risk in water resources. If you're presenting this tool as kind of leading your utility towards a risk-based management framework, so giving people the language and kind of methodologies to you know, have some kind of standard ways to measure and communicate these kind of things.
Great. So sort of related, Ben, we've had someone ask how you evaluate the impact on water quality of these forest treatment projects.
Sorry, Peter, do you mean like the forest treatment projects themselves?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, if you notice, we didn't talk a lot about water quality itself. We talked mainly about just sediment. And really that framework has been kind of been pushed forward by kind of the regional impacts of wildfire here in Colorado. So it's mainly been framed as avoiding this kind of post-fire sediment delivery to infrastructure. And really this dates back to the impacts of the Buffalo Creek and Hayman fires to Denver water resources. So regionally, water utilities have been really concerned about this. And we're really just assuming right now that that's a pretty good proxy for impacts as well on more water quality related parameters. And so, for example, some of the things that our water providers are at least concerned about that make it into their source water protection plans and things like that are elevated heavy metals after fire, especially manganese, and then changed nutrient dynamics, so increased nitrogen and carbon, which can, especially carbon, can cause them some issues in disinfection byproducts in their treatment methods. So we really haven't been explicitly addressing some of those water quality concerns, but assuming that in most cases those track pretty well the sediment.
Great. Thank you, Ben. We've got a few more minutes and a few more questions here, but feel free to submit any others. What has been the extent, Heather, of outreach or education related to the Peaks to People Water Fund? Articles in the local paper, interviews with the radio shows, other venues?
That's a good question. We haven't done a whole lot yet. We do have, we had, spent a lot of time developing our marketing materials and now have a marketing plan. In fact, I'm meeting with them after this to talk about some potential ads and things like that. So most of the stuff we have in our marketing plan are more like Google display ads, Facebook posts, newsletters, things like that. And that's one of the things that I'm really struggling with is, how much is our role in this general public education and how much can we do with one person, me, and how much, should we try to dedicate in terms of that overall outreach and what is really the impact of that. We've even talked about like direct mail options and all different things, and I have a great team of consultants helping me work through all of that.
Great, and we hope this webinar gets the word out a little better and that everybody in attendance today can share this with their colleagues and their networks as well. Ben, can you explain a little more how the probability of fire is calculated in your model?
Sure. So I had to gloss over a lot of the details, obviously, and we're bringing in a burn probability product that Karen Short is the lead author on this product, and it's available on the U.S. Forest Service research sharing website. And what this product is modeled pixel level burn probability. And so they derive this by simulating many thousands of wildfires over many fire seasons and tally the times that each pixel burns. And so this is a conditional estimate of burn probability, and meaning conditional on the present state of the fuel configuration of the landscape. And so this is a raster-based product that we bring in, and we summarize that as up to the small catchment, those units that we're planning for, by taking the mean of that. And so that gives us the mean probability of experiencing fire. And we correct that from an annual basis to a planning period length. And our planning period for the results that I showed you today was a 25-year planning period, which that tracks back to sort of the duration that we think fuel treatments are effective for here, is about 25 years. And so that would be the incorporated in the model as the probability of that piece of land experiencing fire over the planning period.
Great, thank you, Ben. We have a question around the security and redundancy issue. And this participant wonders if it would be possible to compare the expense of creating and maintaining redundancy to the savings of having all sources be more protected through conservation. Redundancy is good for a water utility in an emergency, but it's a short-term fix. If there were multiple emergencies, multiple fires, redundancy would only take you so far. Do you, Heather, think there's potential to address the redundancy issue in the next year in this way or some other way?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still struggling with that. So in my mind, I go to the dramatic two-event scenario. Can we, with a straight face, paint the picture and say, this is what will happen if we have two large events? But then you have to caveat that, model that and maybe model a treatment plan, or I don't know. I don't even know that feeds into the treatment plan, but just trying to paint the picture that this unacceptable scenario could happen without being overly dramatic and without shortchanging the issue of probability, as Ben was just talking about. And I don't know if Ben, you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, I think what I would mention is that redundancy is really the consequence of history here, in that these communities are all connected to the Colorado Big Thompson Project infrastructure, which, just to give some context, most of these communities are getting somewhere between 40 and 50% of their annual water from the Colorado Big Thompson Project. And so that's water that is moved over the divide, and it's moved through a series of conveyances ultimately to some large off-network storage reservoirs. And so it's a relatively protected source of water for these communities. And that's exactly what Fort Collins did following the High Park fire, is their resources on the Poudre were impacted by post-High Park fire sediment and debris. And so for a period of several months during that summer, they had to switch solely to taking water out of Horsetooth Reservoir, which is one of the big terminal reservoirs in the Colorado Big Thompson Project. And so that's just the situation that these three communities are in. And it's not necessarily a scenario that all communities in the western United States are in. And so there are many places in which there are communities that are reliant on either a sole source of water or maybe several smaller sources of water. And what I would also say about redundancy is that the strategy of trying to increase redundancy is rather difficult in the western United States, given that there's not a lot of opportunities to acquire new sources of water, and especially to acquire new sources of water that you can really use, which usually involves storage. And so the strategy of, say, just increasing your net that you can potentially draw water from is a really challenging scenario.
Thank you. Unsurprisingly, we've had a lot of interest in your partnerships with various breweries, ranging from how they can get involved to if they can get free beer out of it and whether you've gotten free beer out of it. But as a general question, how interested and supportive have the breweries been, and how viable do you see those corporate partners for a fund like this?
Yeah, I think they have been and will continue to be an integral part of this. New Belgium and Odell have both provided funding to us for this proof of concept phase. We have not talked about what the potential long-term funding is, but if they do fund us outside of this phase, I really think it will be not only because water is important to beer, but because it's a good thing for the community that they work in. We, of course, also have Anheuser-Busch, and they really work directly with the Nature Conservancy right now. So that's something that we, Peaks to People, and the Nature Conservancy will work together on, is how to kind of work together and potentially forge a partnership in that area as well. But yeah, and then there are many, as you know, I'm sure even those that are not from here, many breweries here, and a lot of them are smaller. So we are and continue to talk about not only breweries but businesses that may want to contribute but aren't able to contribute at the scale of a project. So we hope to have some mechanism to allow supporting Peaks to People to be accessible to some of the smaller businesses and breweries as well.
Wonderful. Well, I'll remind everybody that Heather's contact information is currently up on your screen. I'm sure she'd be more than happy to answer any other questions you have. Again, thank you, Heather and Ben, for your time today and for sharing your experience and insight. Thank you to all of our participants for joining in. We will be posting a recording of this on our website within a day or two, and we hope to have more events like this in the future to share the successes of our other grantees. So thank
After action.